Now, to discuss further on President Moon's visit to the Vatican, we're joined by Dr. Myong-hyun from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So the Blue House has previously mentioned how rare it is for the Vatican to put on a mass like this, because they don't normally do it for a specific nation or for specific visiting dignitaries. But it seems the Vatican pulled out all the stops this time. They allowed President Moon to give an address after the mass to those who were there, as well as the Cardinal State Secretary Pietro Parolin, who greeted President Moon Jae-in and the First Lady Kim Jung-sook in what was a rather amusing, kind of surprising moment when he spoke to them in Korean during the Mass. So, can you tell us, I mean, how special was this Mass, do you think?
Well, I think in many ways very special for President Moon himself personally. I mean, we know President Moon is a Catholic, just like First Lady Kim Jung-sook. So for two Catholic faithfuls to be at the Vatican in the St. Peter's Basilica and celebrate Mass and talk about North Korea must have a very profound meaning for the President Moon. So in that sense, personally very important. But also we have to understand that in this present tour of Europe by President Moon, I think President Moon faced some pushback to his idea of putting sanctions relief before the nuclearization. We know from the statement coming out after the meeting with the French President Emmanuel Macron that the European position or French position regarding North Korea was very clear, that this denuclearization should be complete before any sanctions relief takes place. So I think in a way President Moon was facing some reality check, but in Vatican clearly he found a more receptive audience to his idea, so probably it was very important for him.
What does it say about the fact that the Vatican has allowed this kind of mass to take place? I mean, does it show, you know, about the importance of this North Korea situation, not to the Vatican, but the message it sends to the world as well?
Well, the Catholic Church has a very important principles. I mean, I would say two important principles for the Church would be sanctity of life and also peace. So I think both things kind of square in the case of Korea, the Korean situation in the Korean Peninsula, especially in North Korea. We have to remember that there are almost 6 million Catholic faithfuls here in South Korea. So if there's any contingency in the Korean Peninsula, it will hurt the Church as much as the Korean nation. So I think in that sense, the Catholic Church has a vested interest in seeing stability in the Korean Peninsula.
President Moon is also set to have a sit-down with the Pope himself later today. And, of course, the focus of everyone's attention is that invitation from Kim Jong-un for the Pope to visit North Korea at some point. And there seems to be now growing speculation that Pope Francis will accept. Do you think he will?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, this Pope, just like many of his predecessors, is an engager. He believes in dialogue and peaceful resolution of conflicts. He has made many statements regarding peaceful resolution to ongoing conflicts in many different parts of the world, and Korean Peninsula is just one of them. So I think for a Pope to express deep interest in the Korean Peninsula is very important because the scale of the issue. I mean, it involves nuclear weapons, it involves all the major powers in the world, and also it involves Korea, which is a very important Christian country in East Asia. So I would say that all the conditions are kind of met when it comes to, somehow bringing interest out of the Pope to focus his attention in the Korean Peninsula.
Isn't there a risk, though, that he'll come under fire for some criticism for perhaps legitimizing the North Korean regime with a visit if he goes there?
Well, clearly there's a risk. I mean, I think Pope has been under this kind of criticism before, but then he's willing to take that risk because probably he believes that the upside of engaging North Korea is much, much larger than the downside. I mean, we don't know what's exact calculation that's being made at the Vatican, but then it wouldn't hurt for the Pope to sit down with Kim Jong-un and then somehow open Kim Jong-un's eyes to what's going on in the world, and also bring attention to the fact that if North Korea wants to be seen normal to the international community, then North Korea will have to do something about this horrible human rights record.
So if Pope Francis does accept, how big of a deal will it be for actually North Korea? I mean, what will it mean for their history and their society as well.
Well, clearly, Kim Jong-un is not seeking Pope's blessing for his policy. I mean, he's atheist by default. But then I think he's seeking to get some prestige out of it. I mean, Pope, despite the fact that he's just a religious figure, he's a very influential opinion maker for almost 1.2 billion Catholic faithfuls around the world. So in that sense, counting Pope's support to Kim Jong-un's idea of denuclearization, such as denuclearization of the entire world, rather than, or entire peninsula, rather than just the denuclearization of North Korea, would actually put a lot of prestige to the Kim Jong-un statement. So it's something that the Kim Jong-un is seeking right now, diplomatic and the political prestige. So in that sense, the meeting with the Pope will be very important for him.
So Kim Jong-un will be getting a lot of political prestige. But what do you think about for the North Korean people? What do you think their reaction will be? How would they take someone like the Pope coming to North Korea?
Well, they took the idea of a South Korean president making a speech to them pretty well. So I think they would probably consider the Pope to be just another important political figure who's coming to North Korea to pay the tribute or attention, respect to the dear leader.
Rather than like a religious leader, you're saying?
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, religion is not really allowed in North Korea. So, I mean, from their point of view, religion is just another extension of politics. So.
Interesting. So, obviously, we'll have to see whether Pope Francis does accept, and if that does, that will be a very historic moment. Now, on Wednesday, President Moon also met with the leaders of Italy. So he had a summit with Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, and they released a joint statement together outlining new agreements on various issues that South Korea and Italy would now be pushing forward with, such as trade and defense, among others. But there's also full support from Conte for President Moon's initiatives on North Korean policies. How important do you think it is to have Italy's support, as well as from other countries on North Korea?
Well, after all, I mean, Italy, even though it doesn't really carry much of a weight in this part of the world, it's a very important member of the European Union, as well as the member of the G7. So it's a very important country in many ways. It's very influential in the international public opinion and the international security policy. So counting with Italian support for the President Moon's policy of engaging North Korea is a very important bonus, I would say, of this tour that the President Moon is doing right now. So I think it's actually definitely a plus.
What was noticeable about this summit, though, actually, was there seemed to be no mention of sanctions during the summit, which you also talked about earlier as well. This comes in stark contrast to the summit with the French President, Emmanuel Macron, where he very much pushed for, talked much about easing sanctions on North Korea, possibly in the future. Do you think President Moon is deliberately easing off on this visit after seeing the reaction from the previous visit? Or what do you think why do you think he's eased off on that subject?
I hope that President Moon is doing this deliberately, because I'm just surprised that President Moon went to, of all places, France, and tried to convince the French to relax the sanctions before the denuclearization. If you remember, I mean, I would like to remind the audience that among the European countries that have diplomatic relations with Pyongyang, actually, France is not one of the European countries that has a diplomatic relations with Pyongyang, despite the fact that all other European countries, many of the European countries do. And there's a reason for that, because the reason is because the French actually put priority on human rights situation as well as the denuclearization. And the fact that President Moon didn't take that into account when he was having this meeting with President Macron, it's actually very surprising to me. So I think President Moon probably has some reality check in Paris. So when he went to Italy, probably realized that the Italian reaction to his proposal would have been pretty much the same as the French, because the European Union has a very common, tried to have a very common foreign policy position towards many issues in the world, and North Korea is one of them. So I think it was a very wise move on the part of President Moon not to mention it when meeting with the Italian Prime Minister and Italian President.
Not to pour water on Italy, but as in President Moon will next be meeting with the UK President Theresa May and UK Prime Minister Theresa May, and also the German Chancellor Angela Merkel as well. Do you think he might bring up the issue of sanctions again, especially as they're perhaps bigger players especially in the UN compared to someone like Italy?
Well, he could bring that up. We don't know. But then again, the same explanation applies here, that United Kingdom is on its way out of the European Union. But then Germany, I think, will also, I mean, it could be softer rather than the French, because Germans have a diplomatic relations with North Korea. But then I think, I mean, the statement coming out of Berlin would be actually measured, but then still quite consistent with the European Union's position towards North Korea, that sanctions is actually an important component of pressuring North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. On the other hand, United Kingdom could be a little bit different. I think United Kingdom's priority right now is to see, denuclearization is an important issue, but trade is also a very important issue in South Korea. So the statement coming out of London could be also measured. But then I think the United Kingdom, as a member of the United Nations Security Council, a permanent member, and then also important ally of the United States, will have a very strong position towards North Korea's nuclear issue. So I think it should be wiser for President Moon not to push on that front too much.
This issue of sanctions does seem to be causing some sort of rift, perhaps rift is too strong a word, but at least pulling on two sides between Seoul and Washington, and that's perhaps best shown by recent statements made by the ambassadors of the two countries. So if I look here, the US ambassador to Seoul, Harry Harris, said South Korea and the US need to approach North Korea with a common voice, that's the words he used. And South Korea's ambassador to the US, however, he said it's not possible for the inter-Korean process and the process to denuclearize North Korea to always be at the same speed. Can one argue that both sides have a point, and but can they actually be reconciled?
Well, I mean, the both sides clearly have a point. I mean, but therein lies the uncertainty of engaging North Korea. We don't know which instrument we have to use first. So I think, both ambassadors' positions reflect that reality, a difficult dilemma that the two countries face when it comes to dealing with North Korea. I think the two positions can be reconciled, but then it's a matter of time. Which should come, also the priority, which approach should come first. And I think right now, the approach of pressure should come first, because North Korea has promised to deliver important denuclearization measures in exchange for having this summit with the President Trump, as well as with having inter-Korean summits. So, but then we are still waiting to hear from Pyongyang what kind of denuclearization approach North Korea is going to take in the near future. So we have to wait for that answer first before we engage in expanding economic engagement with North Korea, or even lifting some sanctions measures.
South Korea's Blue House has tried to clarify the situation by saying that they're communicating very closely with the US, and even including all activities with the North, that including the rail and road networks, projects about them connecting and all that as well. But what does South Korea need to be careful going ahead? I mean, what comes next, essentially?
Well, I'm very surprised that the South Korean government's position regarding railway and the road connection with North Korea is actually being discussed deeply with the American counterparts, because that's a very clear violation of the UN sanctions measures. There's it comes out of the Article 7 of the Sanctions Resolution 2397, which forbids member states from lending North Korea help in regarding transportation and then construction materials. That's exactly what South Korea is proposing to do right now. So in that sense, I think even before getting into finding out what kind of American position, what is the American position regarding this issue, we have to be aware that it's actually a very clear violation of the UN sanctions.
Well, that's where we end it. Dr. Gore, thank you for coming in as always and sharing your insights.
Yeah.